Well, we'll go ahead and get started today. I want to thank everybody for coming out. This is our annual Constitution Day observance that we have. We have it every year. Usually have it on the 17th, but this year we had a conflict because our department does so many programs and facilitates so many events, so that's a good thing. We were busy, so we moved it back a week, but appreciate everybody coming out today. A few introductions. I'm Dr. Aaron Mason. This is Mr. Kirk Rogers. I'm with the Political Science program. He's with the Criminal Justice program, and we're with the Department of Social Sciences here at Northwestern. And just want to appreciate everybody coming out, and thank you for coming out. I know it's kind of getting close to the end of the day, but and I'm glad to see some of my athletes are here today. Are y'all here with special permission from Coach Hall, or? Oh, okay. No. Close enough. I was hoping I was special, but he just had nowhere else to go, I guess, right? No, Stefan, he wanted to be here. I know. I appreciate that. I'm glad everybody's here. The Second Amendment. This is a topic that gets a lot of traction in Oklahoma and nationwide, and so it is an important topic. Guns and firearms are really an integral part of the American identity. It's kind of hard to think about America without having a gun-owning tradition. It's very much a part of our culture, and I think that anybody who wants to deal with this subject has to begin with that reality. Whether you like that or you don't like that, whether you embrace it or reject it, that's very much a part of the American cultural and historical context. And oftentimes this discussion becomes emotional, ephemeral, and oftentimes incoherent on both sides, I would argue. And I think at the same time, though, this topic can be more measured, it can be logical, and it can be amenable to compromise. I think that's what we have to remember here, that both sides have valid arguments. It's one thing to say that people have the right to own firearms. It's another thing to say that we're not quite the same society we were in 1787. So I think there's some compromise for both sides here. Today we're just going to kind of give an overview of the issue of gun rights in America. And the direction that I would like to take my part of the talk here is kind of an overview of the right of firearm ownership and how we might conceptually think about owning firearms within a purely constitutional perspective, relating this back to Constitution Day, and try to take some of the emotion out of it. Okay, if we could just go to the next text here. Just to make this simple, we're going to elaborate PowerPoint and everything because I want to give the balance of time for discussion and for question and answers, and I want to give Mr. Rogers plenty of time to talk as well. It's to talk about framing the discussion of guns and gun rights to conceptualize them into kind of two overarching categories. And I think the first way we can look at gun ownership is first as a civil right, okay? And those of y'all who have had me in class before know this, that a fundamental distinction exists between civil rights and civil liberties. Okay? Civil rights, as far as definition goes, rights are privileges which are defined by society, as opposed to, say, our civil liberties. So what we're talking about here when we compare and contrast civil rights and civil liberties, we're talking about societal rights versus natural rights. More specifically, then, our civil liberties are our natural rights that we have by virtue of our humanity. So we're talking, and these are not perfect distinctions. They can sometimes bleed over into each other. But when we talk about our natural rights, we mean our rights of conscience, rights of free worship, free speech, those types of things. Things that the government can regulate but are generally reticent to do so and are not easily amenable to regulation. Contrast that with our societal rights, which would be our civil rights, rights which society extends or retracts. So some examples of those would be voting, holding public office. Marriage is a civil right, historically defined as in order to marry, you have to meet the definition extended by society. And then I would also put under this gun rights. Gun rights, in my mind, are a civil right. They are a right that is defined by law. You do not have an exclusive 100% right to own a firearm, no more than you have a 100% exclusive right to vote. You don't. And back in 2000, the case of Bush versus Gore reiterated that case. That's case law. It's only 14 years old. There's not even an explicit constitutional protection to vote. It is explicitly defined by state law. So if you don't have an explicit right to vote, you don't have an explicit right to, and I would say explicit meaning unqualified, you don't have a 100% unqualified right to own a firearm. You don't. So that's something I think that the pro-gun people have to keep in mind. All of this, of course, is under the general state police power, which is a part of the 10th Amendment, which reserves to the states all of the rights which are not granted to the federal government. So under this, we see lots of other rights and privileges that are defined by state statute, by state law. Laws dealing with obscenity, alcohol, public education, which is compulsory, public safety. All of these laws are determined by the states according to the individual character of the states. Okay, so that's the first thing we should keep in mind when we think about gun rights, that it's a civil rights issue. Okay? And as a result, then, states can be as liberal with that. When I say liberal, meaning they can give as many rights to gun owners as they like, or they can be more restrictive, because they do that with all these other very important public safety issues as well. Okay, the second thing I would say in this regard, then, is that guns are largely a matter of ordered liberty. This is a phrase that John Adams was very fond of. You may remember John Adams, our second president, one of our greatest founding fathers. He talked about the idea of having ordered liberty, that one's liberty does not extend to such an extent that they can harm other people. And this is, of course, if you're interested, you can look up the case law that I've provided here. The famous case of Terminello versus Chicago in 1949, which some of my students, I think, are recognizing from the con law class, is a case dealing with the issue of ordered liberty. And it was Justice Robert Jackson, one of the judges on the Supreme Court, who gave this famous ruling that he spoke in the dissenting category, but he basically made this famous phrase that America is a country of ordered liberty, that the state has a right to restrict certain aspects of personal behavior for public good. Plain and simple. And this was a free speech case, so he was willing to say that even civil liberties can be curtailed. So if civil liberties like free speech can be curtailed, certainly civil rights the government has right to restrict certain privileges that people have even under the Second Amendment. So things like the registration of cars, it's not hard to see why we should register guns. If cars are a matter of public safety, so should guns. So should guns be, I should say. And the entire idea of federalism is, of course, based upon the right of states to determine such matters. So the idea that states have the right to impose limitations on gun owners is not at all inconsistent with the Constitution, particularly when we go here to the next line. Now, before you think I'm trying to take one side in this debate, let me counter it both sides here. I believe that people do have a right to own firearms. I think that's completely supported by the Second Amendment and by other constitutional provisions, as we'll go along and see here. But I think, again, it's not an absolute right. And I think there are qualifications to that right. So let's look here at the often quoted Second Amendment, but oftentimes perhaps misunderstood Second Amendment. The only thing that the U.S. Constitution says about firearm ownership explicitly is in the Second Amendment, where it says, you can read it here, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, there's nothing there that says that Aaron Mason can have a hunting rifle, is it? Or anybody else. Insert your name. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say you can't either, okay? But what we know from that historically, and we can refer to this later here with Federalist Paper number 46 by James Madison, is to say that the founders are simply arguing that states have a right of self-defense, be that against the federal government, be that against brigands and outlaws within the forces of civil disorder that might challenge the state, whatever it may be. The state has the state, okay, has a right to defend itself. That's what the Second Amendment is saying. What is the militia then? That is the question. Now, there's a famous law called the Dix Act from 1902 that attempts to clarify this situation, and if you're really interested in gun rights, you know about the Dix Act of 1902. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today because we don't simply have the time, but I would argue that the Dix Act does not fully explain what the militia is. the militia is this amorphous term that has existed prior to the commencement of the United States, prior to the Constitution itself. So I think one can make a good argument that the militia is whatever the state chooses it to be. So in order to determine that, we have to ask what our state constitutions say. So if you scroll down a little bit, you get the full text here. The Oklahoma State Constitution, in Article 2, Section 26, which is the essentially the Bill of Rights section of the state constitution, has a provision dealing with the bearing and carrying of arms. This is not unique to Oklahoma. A number of states, particularly in the South and West, typically have this provision in which it says the right of a citizen to keep and bear arms in defense of his home, person, or property, and here's the kicker, or in aid of the civil power when thereunto legally summoned shall never be prohibited, but nothing herein contained shall prevent the legislature from regulating the carrying of weapons. There's the clincher. How does one argue the right to own a personal firearm from the U.S. Constitution? Well, it's kind of hard without the state constitution. Essentially, the state constitution the federal constitution delegates this responsibility. It kicks it down to the state level and says, it's your business, it's your right to determine that. The Oklahoma State Constitution clearly says that civilians have the right to own firearms for these purposes. So defense of home, defense of person, defense of property. So you can own a rifle, you can own a shotgun, although it doesn't say that specific type of rifle, but whatever the state says you're legally entitled to own. Okay. And then further on, I think Mr. Rogers may talk about this later, when we talk about some of the laws that the state has passed concerning the carrying of firearms, the maintaining of firearms, the legislature is absolutely constitutionally charged with creating those laws that deal with that issue. So in summation, I think we can make this basic argument that ownership of firearms is a right that Americans have. It is defined largely by and I know this sounds contradictory, but the lack of guidance in the federal Constitution, which then by definition is kicked down to the states to the 10th Amendment in their state constitutions and is then redefined at that state level. The real debate is not so much whether or not we have a right to firearms, I think we can establish that. It's the type of firearm that we can have and how we may carry it. And again, I think that decision is best left to the state legislatures. Now, the issue of guns, of course, has a federal implication in terms of commerce. If guns are being trafficked legally or illegally across state lines, yes, that's obviously a federal issue. Under the Commerce Clause, the Congress has the absolute right to become involved in the transportation. If it's going over state lines, that's interstate commerce, but if it's intra, I think that's more of a state issue. And I think the genius of what the founders have created here is just like with any other policy issue, the state has the right to determine what it wants for itself. So we see this in other forms of federalism, the types of laws that states want to create. If you want to have a very liberal policy towards guns, in this case meaning that you allow people to have lots of firearms, and like Oklahoma does, tends to be a gun-friendly state, that's your choice. Otherwise, you can be restrictive with that and be less open about having firearms. Okay, and I would also say there's no question that it's not a simple matter. I would agree that you just say, well, you let the states run everything. I would agree there's a role for the federal government here. But I would like to show these. I think these are the obvious things that we can point out in terms of a constitutionally speaking perspective. And again, I think we should always remember state constitutions go hand in hand with the federal. The founders never intended for the federal constitution to supplant state constitutions in every regard. So we must always consider the interplay of those. And I think oftentimes that's one thing that's missing from the debate here. All right. Great. Mr. Rogers, do you want to present your side of this? Thank you.
I think I should have gone first because that's going to be a hard act to follow. Some of the things that Dr. Mason was pointing out was that early in our history, certainly when it came to gun laws, and even the prohibiting some guns in our society, it went back to the state. And what the state wanted to do was kind of where we fell as far as our gun laws went. I'm a little nervous looking out on everybody. I don't know why. I think it's this camera that's right in front of me that's really made me nervous. I told Lynn that. Throughout our early history, one of the things that was really interesting when it came to gun laws is an era we commonly refer to as the Old West. I mean, most of us, when we think about the Old West, what is it that we think about? I mean, what are some of the things you vision in your head when I mention the Old West?
Dodge City.
Dodge City, right? Deadwood, South Dakota, maybe Tombstone, Arizona. And what is that perception that's in your head when you're talking about things like gun violence, for example? I mean, everybody was carrying guns, right? We all think of those shootouts at the OK Corral, and we think of everybody lining up on Main Street at noon, and when the clock chimes, everybody's drawing their guns. That's the way we settled scores, right? And the truth of the matter is, if you look back into the period we've referred to as the Old West, we had probably some of the most restrictive gun laws in our nation's history. And that was mostly due in part to city ordinances that were passed by local units of government, or even laws that were passed by state government as well. If you walked into Dodge City or Tombstone or Deadwood, typically you'd find big signs right in the middle of the town square that said the carrying of firearms is prohibited. All weapons must be turned into the sheriff. They'll give you a check. And what a check was back then was basically a token, just a little token to show that you had turned your gun into the sheriff's office or the proper authorities. If you were caught on the street, you were arrested. If you were carrying a firearm, actually you were probably beaten and then arrested. A little bit different law enforcement tactic then. But the point of it was that you were arrested. And the federal government essentially looked at it that it was the state and local authorities that had the authority to make those decisions on what was appropriate in their town. Dr. Mason pointed out that when it came to things like obscenity or pornography or anything, the courts consistently said that was a community standard. Whatever was acceptable for that particular community is what was legal. When you're looking at firearms violence back from the Old West, and I have a statistic here I pulled up I thought was kind of interesting. We'll look at Abilene, and for those of you that like history, Abilene was considered the worst of the worst in the Old West, wasn't it? I won't say what it is now, but certainly at the time it was awful. So Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge City, Caldwell, these were all cow towns. These were all towns, if you're a fan of the Old West, that when you think of the long cattle drives, this is where all these cattle were being driven to so that they could be shipped off to the east and west coasts. And so these were kind of the rowdy towns. There was a lot of prostitution. There was a lot of gambling, a lot of vice. And they absolutely didn't allow firearms. You could pretty much do anything else, just don't carry a gun. From the years of 1870 to 1885, in all those towns, there were only 45 total homicides. So a 15-year period in the biggest cow towns in the West, there's only 45 homicides. It equated to a rate of about one homicide per every 100,000 people. And there again, we did have some of the most restrictive gun laws in our history at the time. Abilene, for example, which was considered one of the worst, in 1869 and 1870, there was no homicides, period. Now, if we look to 2007, and those are the statistics that I have, most recent statistics that I had, if you compare that to where we are now, in Washington, D.C., there were 183 murders in 2007, which equates to about 31 deaths per 100,000 people. If you look at New York with 494 murders, it equates to 6 per 100,000, just a much larger population. Baltimore, there were 281 murders, so it equates to about 45 deaths per 100,000. And in Newark, which has gotten top billing for the number of homicides per capita the past couple of years, don't go to New Jersey. You have 104 murders, which equates to about 37 deaths per 100,000 residents. If you're looking at those 2007 statistics, for example, when you're talking about firearms violence in the United States, you have about 266 people a day that are injured as a result of firearms-related violence. Of those 266, 82 of them are going to die every day because of the use of a firearm. I just bring this up. I told Dr. Mason when I came in here, because the whole point of this is to try to stir debate and to give you guys some opposing views. I'm playing the bad guy today. I'm talking a little bit about restrictions and maybe some of the pros to having gun restrictions. Does everybody know who James Brady is? I always ask that in my classes. I know some of us that are a little older do. He just passed away, yeah. Dr. Mason pointed that out. He just passed away. James Brady was press secretary for President Ronald Reagan back in 1981 when Reagan, a lot of presidents get shot. Back when Reagan was shot by John Hinckley Jr. John Hinckley Jr. actually had a history of mental illness. He shot the president with the idea that he was going to be able to impress Jodie Foster, if you guys know Jodie Foster, the actor or actress. I always say that nothing says I love you more than I'm willing to kill a president to show you just how much I love you. I don't think that worked for him. But when Hinckley attempted to assassinate Reagan, he also shot James Brady. And James Brady actually took a pretty horrific wound to the head. And really, when we're talking about gun restrictions now, most of that is stemming from the actions of James Brady and his foundation. It's the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. It's been around for a long, long time. Because of the Brady bill that was passed shortly after that, that's the reason that we have to go through background checks when we go to buy a firearm. It used to be, back in the 80s when the Brady bill was first passed, because it took so long to get those background checks done properly, that there was a waiting period for firearms. You could wait up to 5 days before you bought a gun. You could go in and buy it, actually, but then you had to come back 5 days later and pick it up. And a lot of the thought behind that was that that would do away with a lot of the crimes of passion, where maybe I'm angry at somebody and I decide that I want to take their life. I'm going to go buy a firearm, and I'm going to go do what I'm wanting to do. I'm going to go harm that person. And the idea was maybe after that waiting period, you'll have a little bit of a cool down period and think, oh, well, maybe that's not a good idea. We don't really have those waiting periods anymore because our background checks are instantaneous. They're pretty quick. If you bought a firearm recently, when you go and you fill out that ATF form, they run the background check on you, and they can have it back in 10 or 15 minutes, and you're walking out the store with a gun. What I always try to explain in my criminal justice classes when we're talking about criminal theory is I'm a big believer in the routine activity theory that if you have a motivated offender and you have a suitable target and you have an absence of a capable guardian, there's a really big likelihood that a predatory crime is going to take place. They always looked at that waiting period as the capable guardian that was preventing some kind of a crime like that from happening. On the other side of the coin, though, I always say that if you have a motivated offender, it doesn't matter what kind of guardian is in place, they're going to find a way to get around it. And so the waiting periods worked to a certain extent, but they didn't always work. There was a good example of a case up in New York City where a guy actually made a list of things he was going to do that day. Go grocery shopping, pick up my dry cleaning, kill a bunch of people on a subway, buy a gun, kill a bunch of people on a subway. And when we went to buy the gun, they said, you're going to have to come back in 5 days. All he did was change his date book. There were cases like that. But I am not opposed to some restrictions when it comes to firearms. There have been some, I say that from a public safety standpoint. I look at some of the laws that are out there, dealing with firearms, and I don't think they're so intrusive to trample on somebody's constitutional right to bear arms. Typically, when you're looking at some of those laws, and I point those out, I mean, would you all agree that if I'm 15 years old, should I be able to buy a gun? Should I be able to possess a firearm?
I think it all depends. It's a situational circumstance. You can't. I think it'd be the wrong idea to throw a blanket over every 15-year-old.
You don't think you should throw a blanket over every 15-year-old?
Everyone comes from different backgrounds. Everyone trips different grades.
We have a little bit different attitude when it comes to firearms out here in the Midwest, don't we? Most of us grew up with firearms, right? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I think I got that first Red Ryder BB gun when I was about 5 years old, right? You know, we started out with BB guns and worked our way up to 22s. Most of us have been around guns. I know I certainly grew up in a little bit different era. When I went to high school, I can remember people had gun racks in the back of their pickup trucks out in the parking lots. You're not going to see that anymore, are you? And we do. We have a little bit different attitude when it comes to firearms out here because we've been around it. I think education is important in that regard. We're a little bit more educated when it comes to being around firearms. But I think for the most part we would still agree that just not every kid should be able to go and buy a handgun or buy firearms. That was actually a decision that was just most recently affirmed in a decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in 2009 called U.S. versus Renege. Where you had a juvenile basically that was saying that he should be able to possess a firearm or even purchase a firearm because he has a constitutional right to it. And the courts consistently have said in this case as well, it's a long-standing tradition of prohibiting juveniles from both receiving and possessing handguns. And the federal ban on juvenile possession of handguns is part of a long-standing practice of prohibiting certain classes of individuals from possessing firearms. So when we're talking about gun restrictions, we're okay with that, aren't we? Everybody okay with that? What about a felon? Should a convicted felon be able to purchase or possess a firearm, do you think?
Depends on the conviction, what charge it was.
Depends on the conviction? What do you guys think?
I would assume so. I mean, they kind of committed a felon, so therefore, felony, so therefore, maybe not. But also, if they just did I think it depends on the crimes, kind of.
So you think it depends on the crime?
Yeah, kind of.
Violent felons, that's asking for trouble, but there's also non-violent felons.
What about for some misdemeanor crimes?
Again, violent misdemeanors, probably no-go.
Violent misdemeanors, you think?
Matter of fact, that's a question on Form 7.
It is a question, and when it comes to misdemeanor violations, what specific crime is it they're asking about?
As far as misdemeanors, drugs, and violence. That's all I'm.
But there's one in particular, a misdemeanor crime.
Domestic violence?
Domestic violence. If you've been arrested or convicted of domestic violence, you'd be able to possess a firearm. What about if somebody has filed a protective order against you? I mean, even if you live 4 states away.
Yeah, but...
You can't hop on a plane but till then.
Well, the only place you're going to be able to get a firearm into an airport here in the United States is Georgia. I laugh at this. Last year, the Georgia legislature came in and they passed one of the most unique laws dealing with firearms and pretty much said that you could carry a firearm anywhere in the state of Georgia, even into an airport, up to the security checkpoint. Yeah, up to the security checkpoint, you couldn't go past it with your firearm. Ironically, there was only one building that they restricted as far as anybody being able to walk into with a firearm. Does anybody want to venture to guess what building it was? Yeah, it was a Capitol building. And you guys can carry them anywhere, just not where we were. Just inviting trouble there. But domestic violence. Those restrictions have all been in place for quite a while, just for that very reason. We know we're not going to carry them into the airport. We know we're not going to be able to carry them into into some public buildings, we seem to be all right with those restrictions. One of the areas that and he kind of touched on it a little bit when he was talking about the First Amendment. We know we have the right to say really whatever we want to say, but we also know that there can be restrictions on that. I can't walk into a movie theater and yell fire.
Unless it's on fire.
Unless it's on fire.
Yeah.
And then
you're supposed to.
Then I'm supposed to.
Right.
We know there's certain things that if we say, we can get in trouble for saying it. So there are restrictions there. And one of the most recent cases dealing with guns that came out of the Supreme Court that kind of addressed that was the 2008 decision of District of Columbia versus Heller. And the Heller case was kind of a unique case. There was another case in Chicago, I believe it was McDonald versus Chicago, that absolutely prohibited the possession or ownership of firearms in those particular cities. You couldn't even possess a firearm in your house in Chicago or Washington, D.C. And rightly so, the court said that's a little too restrictive. But they made a statement in that case, and I printed it off because I wanted to read it correctly. It says, like most rights, the Second Amendment right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever reason. It said the court's opinion here in overturning this particular law should not be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons or the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. The court had no problem with that. They don't see any problem in restricting what type of gun we can own. We tend to clump firearms into just kind of one easy-to-understand group and say that a gun's a gun, for example. A rifle's a rifle, a shotgun's a shotgun. Realistically, that's not the case at all. I mean, when you're looking at situations like the carrying of machine guns, should we be able to buy machine guns? Should we be able to buy fully automatic weapons?
It's legal right now.
You can. The thing is, you can. It's a pretty restricted process to go through. And it can take a couple of years. But, yeah, you can buy a fully automatic weapon, but should just anybody be able to do that? What do we need automatic weapons for? Typically, we think of guns like the Bushmaster and the AR-15, things like that. I don't know of anybody that hunts with those, is what I'm getting at. Maybe you. I don't know. Maybe you. But for the most part, I don't think a lot of people are hunting with those kind of weapons. Anybody know, I'm sure a few people do, what a 50 caliber machine gun is? You do? Anybody been in the military and shot a 50 cal? For those of you that don't know a 50 caliber machine gun, think of a Humvee or something that you've seen in Afghanistan that's got the huge machine gun mounted on it. I think the bullets are about 7 inches long. If you try to go deer hunting, you might find a hoof after you shot the deer. That might be the only thing you had left to mount. Be like, I got him. There's really no practical purpose for that other than a military-type application. And actually, the courts have defined arms. When we're talking about the right to bear arms, they defined arms in some cases as weapons that aren't designed with a military use in mind. So you're talking about things like your machine guns and stuff like that. But we also, I think, tend to clump into our Second Amendment right things like ammunition. You know, if somebody says that you can't buy a certain bullet, people say, oh, that's against my Second Amendment right. Ammunition is not covered under the Second Amendment. You know, I don't think everybody should be able to go out and buy black Talon bullets and armor-piercing rounds. Why would you need armor-piercing rounds? I don't know any deers that are wearing bulletproof vests, although they might if they hear you got 50 cows.
It's the next step in evolution.
But yeah, next step in evolution. Go ahead.
Why are we working under the assumption of the Second Amendment about
it's not always about hunting. I mean, and Dr. Mason touched on this a little while back. I mean, when you were talking about a well-regulated militia, we had a real problem with standing armies following the birth of this nation. The idea of a standing army was something that was really at the back of our mind. We weren't really keen on that idea of having a full-time military. And so in times of crisis or civil disobedience or something like that, the people were the militia, basically. It was kind of a call to arms. If you're looking at law enforcement, from a law enforcement standpoint, I mean, that was where the whole concept of posse comitatus came from, was if somebody committed a crime, you rounded up everybody and they got their rifles and shotguns and whatever, and you pursued the suspect. I think the concept of the standing army, and Dr. Mason and actually Dr. Schmaltz can help me with this. There was an uprising in 1794, wasn't it? Yeah. Where it was everything they could do to scramble enough people to get together to put down this rebellion, basically, and that made them stop and think, well, maybe we need to come up with a better system.
Whiskey was 1794, and Shays was 1786. Yeah, it was before that. Yeah. But that highlights this tension between the Second Amendment and state constitutions, because clearly the Second Amendment is written in a way that it's obvious it's the federal government it's concerned about, because the Bill of Rights was always meant to apply negatively to the federal government and positively to the states. There are no prohibitions in the Bill of Rights applied to the states. They are always applied to the federal government. So the implication is that the federal government is the issue, the object of fear. And Madison makes this clear. If you want to scroll down at the Federalist number 46, the last document we have here. This is the one I often quote in class. And Madison says, just to cut through all of this, because it's a long, well-written essay, but it's very long and wordy. He says that even if the federal government were to create a standing army, okay, and he's writing this to allay the fears of those who would be opposed to the Constitution. He says, to the army would yield, he says, 1/25th a part of the number able to bear arms. He says, to these would be opposed a militia amounting to nearly 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men choosing from among themselves, fighting for their common liberties, and united and conducted by governments possessing their affections and confidence. It's clear he's saying that the states have the right to arm themselves against the intrusions of an oppressive federal government. That's without doubt. If you disagree with that, then we're not reading the same document. But the question then is, how do we, like you said, how do we square this today? Are we still going to have an interpretation of the Constitution where we want to pit the states against the federal government? The conservatives typically say, yeah, we want to maintain that posture. Liberals want to kind of say, no, that's not what it's saying. We have a very, very, you have to understand the time which this was written. Madison he's kind of on the fence there. He doesn't know if he's a nationalist, but he also defends states' rights. And so he's very much in this vein of saying the states have to have the ability to defend themselves from an oppressive federal government. I don't have a good answer here, other than to say that's what he's telling us, and that's the position that the Second Amendment takes. I would also go a step further and say that Madison actually he's wrong in this. His logic is correct, but his math doesn't work out well, because he doesn't understand the way the country's going to eventually turn out. That it's not going to be a city, like an urban versus rural fight over guns. It's going to be a north-south thing. He's thinking before the country has matured fully. This is 1788. He writes this. He doesn't realize that the more populous North will eventually go to war with the numerically inferior South. So it doesn't matter how many guns the South has. The National Army under Abraham Lincoln will be able to crush the militias of the South. So I just throw that in there as an example. It's one of the few examples. No one loves the Founding Fathers more than I. But this is one prophecy that he makes that's not actually correct. His logic makes sense, but so I throw that out there to say, do we need to rethink how we interpret these things? That's all. I don't have the answer. But clearly he's talking about states and the federal government having conflicts. And he comes down on the right of the side of states to defend themselves, without question.
It's definitely been that way for a while. I think everybody's been, from the founding fathers on, concerned about gun restriction, and I think that's one of the things that we always worry about here in the United States, is that somebody's going to take our guns, especially here in the Midwest. And I think if you look at different times throughout our history when we're talking about those fears, it seems like any time that a Democrat is elected to the presidency, those fears seem to escalate exponentially. It happened with Clinton. It happened with Obama most recently. That the Democrats are going to come in and they're going to take our guns. And I always kind of chuckle at that a little bit, because I do an experiment in some of my classes to kind of demonstrate this, how realistically I don't think that could ever happen. We got a room full of people here, so it's going to be a little harder to do, but I always ask people, how many guns do you have access to? How many guns are in your home right now? I can say 8. I have 8 guns at my house. Some people are like, I'm not telling anybody how many guns I got. How many you got?
Double digits.
I think if I'm not mistaken, before I made that comment, he said 50.
15-ish.
15-ish. Oh, 15. So anybody else want to? 3?
Yeah, none.
2? You have a gun?
You don't have any.
You don't have any? You're a statistical anomaly. We're throwing you out of the survey here. 23 guns. 17. So realistically, what do we have? Like 6 people? Say how many guns they have, and we probably got about 100 firearms between us. We are the most well-armed society in the world.
Okay, but let's just take that the other side. How many murders do we have in Alva? Gun murders. How much gun violence do we have in Alva? I don't know. What are the statistics? I doubt it's Chicago.
Yeah,
So
I don't think it's
the presence of guns obviously doesn't necessarily cause a crime situation.
It doesn't.
And you yourself said how, when we were in high school, that there was a proliferation and they didn't have the problem. So
I just think it was also got to go beyond the necessity. You talked about, we don't need an AR-15 to hunt with, and you're right, we don't. But there are a lot of things we don't need that we can still have access to and not use negatively. What's wrong with recreational shooting? I need a vehicle to go to work, but I don't need a $50,000 SUV to go to work.
I will agree with him. The AR-15,
right.
a lot of fun to shoot if you ever get the opportunity. A lot of fun to shoot. You're right. There are guns that are designed for recreational purposes. The problem with anything, and it's not just firearms. I am a believer in the fact that guns don't kill people. It's people that kill people. If we didn't have guns, we'd be doing it with rocks or spears or arrows or swords. We'd find a way to make that happen. If that was our desired intent, our desired outcome, we would find a way to make that happen. It's definitely the misuse of the firearms that certainly cause problems. Although I think from a criminal justice standpoint, we can't all agree that there are just certain people that don't need to possess those firearms. People with mental illnesses are a good example. We talk about the Brady bill where we're running checks on people, and when it comes to mental illness, that's where I really do have an issue when it comes to those background checks, because there is no database that says that somebody has a mental illness. I mean, if you want to look at some of the statistics, do I have any psychologists in here? Psychology majors? What's the statistic? Like 1 out of every 3 people in the United States has a diagnosable mental illness, which means that if you're not crazy and you're not crazy, he is. I mean, easy way to pick that up.
If you undergo gun training, they should make you undergo a psychological evaluation before you are able to practice. They should make it a little bit more difficult for somebody to
That's just it. Is it too invasive? Right now, it basically works on the honor system. Go ahead. Do you want to? I do or they do? Both. I'm sorry.
Basically, they don't. The reason why they don't link people's mental health records with gun ownership is because a lot of people believe it's too intrusive on their life.
Did you guys catch that? I mean, realistically, if they're running a background check on you, there are some times if you dealt with law enforcement and we've taken you into custody for an emergency detention order or something like that because you're a threat to yourself or somebody else, there may be a record of that that's reflected when a background is ran. But somebody who has taken the initiative to get counseling on their own or address a mental health issue on their own, we don't know about. We don't know about that.
I mean, those that are schizophrenic, bipolar, manic depressive, all that, they can just go get a gun and then one day they're having a bad day and it's society's problem.
Right, there is no database there. And so that I think, is something that needs to be addressed. That it should be evaluated, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
If you don't want to go about with the privacy, then you shouldn't be able to own a gun, honestly. Because you know what? If you're not willing to go along with what they want you to, then why should you be able to own a gun? Obviously, there's something wrong with you if you're wanting to hide something.
Everybody know who Jared Loeffner is?
But who's going to pay for it to have them evaluate it psychologically if they don't have any history or anything?
You guys remember Jared Loeffner? Some people are nodding their head. What if I mention Aurora, Colorado? You guys know who Jared Loeffner is now? Went in and shot up the movie theater? And you can just look at him and he almost looked crazy, didn't he? I mean, there was that picture of him after the shooting, his mugshot. You guys remember his mugshot? When he had the purple hair because he dressed up like the Joker for the Batman premiere. Definitely somebody who had a severe history of mental illness and was able to go and legally purchase firearms because it really does boil down to the honor system on that ATF form. Do you have a mental illness? No. Oh, good.
Well, that's like Larry has said, she has 23 guns in her house. Well, if she has a relative staying with her and they have a background, I mean, they can just easily access one of hers.
Absolutely.
It's a pretty big assumption. It's not like they're just guns laying all around the house.
It comes down to
Well,
responsible
I
gun
mean-
ownership and storage too.
Well, and I think that we touched on that is the difference between here and places like California, New York, New Jersey. We grew up in a different environment. We are educated when it comes to firearms. My kids, for example, my boys have been shooting since they were probably the age of 6. We've been going out to the range and shooting. I always tell this story in some of my law enforcement classes about we had some guys come in from California one time for a law enforcement conference. We were in Oklahoma City and we're driving down the road. And these guys are in the back of the car, and they start screaming, "Gun, gun, gun!" So everybody's panicking. I mean, we're dropping, we're getting below the windows, we're panicked, we're pulling our guns, we're trying to look to see where the threat is at, and we don't see anything. And they're still screaming, "Gun!" And we're like, "Where?" Pointed at a truck that had a gun rack in the back, and the guy's rifle was just hanging there. And we're like, what? You're not going to do anything about that? No. Man, that wouldn't happen out in California. So things are a little different.
See, the point is they're not violating the law. It's an open.
They weren't violating the law.
That's the whole point. So that's why I think these one-size-fits-all policies, like so many things from Washington, D.C., to try to impose a single solution, it's inconsistent with established constitutional practice. It's inconsistent with case law. It's not. That's one reason why we don't have a standard voter law from across all states. These are matters that the states must grapple with on their own. And the gun violence, which does occur in Oklahoma, there is gun violence here, but it's not as endemic even in our large cities, it's not as endemic as what you'll find in Chicago, New York. Those are specific cases that have their own unique issues that the legislatures in Springfield and Albany have to deal with, not D.C. and certainly not Oklahoma City. I think that's where we always have to come back to, and I think people do handle firearms better, more proficiently in Oklahoma. Generally speaking, they do.
Well, what makes it tough now,
I think you're right.
For us in law enforcement, going back to what he was saying about the guy in the truck, he wasn't doing anything wrong. When you're talking about the Second Amendment, you're talking about Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, New Mexico. A lot of these states have open carry laws. I mean, if I wanted to strap on a pistol to my hip right now, I could go walking anywhere with that on. And where it creates a pretty unique public safety dilemma is if I'm walking down the street with that gun strapped to my hip and somebody calls and says there's a guy walking down the street with a gun, he's not really doing anything wrong, is he? But it still makes people nervous. It scares people. And where it creates a dilemma for us as a law enforcement officer is if, I'll use him as an example, if I approached him and said, what are you doing, sir? What do you mean? It becomes an instant conflict because he feels like I'm intruding on his constitutional right to carry that firearm, where all I'm trying to do is make sure that there's nothing wrong. Who are you? Do you have any identification? I want to run a background on you just to make sure that you don't have a felony or, that you can legally possess that firearm. But it really does turn into a constitutional dilemma for us because some people feel that's a complete intrusion on their right to do that.
Is the open carry law, sorry, I'm not good at this, but is it part of the full faith and credit clause? Is it under that, or do you have to get recertified in each state?
No, it's state by state. Yeah.
That's a good point, Josie. Yeah. That again reiterates this point that it's a state issue. Massachusetts should not be required to push you out of the way.
No, that's fine. Push me.
Massachusetts should not be required to recognize Oklahoma's CCW. We shouldn't have to. Likewise, the laws that Massachusetts has on guns should not apply in Oklahoma. Unless there's a federal issue, unless you have a gun runner that's violating some issue. I'm not saying there's no role for the feds. There has to be, particularly if you have guys that are illegally smuggling guns in violation of state law across. That's a job of the federal marshals, of the U.S., the ATF, and other agencies that would deal with that. But that's exactly the point. Couch that within it. See, you took common law, didn't you? There you go. There you go. See, practical application.
What's the reciprocity between the states on carry?
It varies from state to state.
Yeah, decided entirely by the legislature.
By the state legislature.
Every state we touch and a few others.
Yeah, and that's what it should be. But I think y'all hit on the mental health issue. The states should be sharing information and go into a database. That makes total sense. And to me, again, to a certain point, the owning of a gun, you can link it to almost a public act in the sense that if it's something regulated by the state, then the same way when you want to get a driver's license, you're no longer completely within the private realm. You're somewhat in the public realm. So if states want to impose a background check that includes that, I don't think that's necessarily going too far. I don't think so. As long as, and the courts would have to come up with some kind of, background or some kind of criteria to say what is too intrusive and what is not. But I think to say, have you ever been locked up in a mental institution, have you ever committed, I don't think that's an intrusive question. That's one that public safety would warrant. I think that makes sense. We license people for all kinds of things. You can't operate most businesses without a state license. For whether it's a barber, whether it doesn't affect some of us so much, but a barber, an electrician, a plumber, those things are all regulated by state law. So if trades are regulated, this is a public safety issue. So I think if we start thinking within those terms, we have a more concrete way of defining it. We see firearm ownership as a civil right. I think that provides a better way of looking at the entire idea here. rather than some kind of amorphous idea that I have this, like you said, absolutely right. It's not that simple. And likewise, the Second Amendment is important, and I think in the Heller case, the court was right to say, no, the states they can have, essentially regulatory and not prohibitory policies. They cannot just carte blanche prohibit it, but they certainly have the right to regulate it, as Oklahoma does under this regard. I think that's a balance. Again, that's a compromise between these extremes of people who want to just, free gun day for everybody at the mental asylum and let them go because it's everybody's right, and the gun grabbing, people that want to take everybody's guns and really do want it. There are people that are that crazy on both sides that see no restrictions as the way to go, and then they want to restrict everybody's rights. So once again, the truth is usually between two extremes. I think that's what we're trying to say here.
Well, I think when you're talking about gun restriction, people are worried about somebody coming in and taking our firearms away from us. Although I think it's to the point, we had a discussion pertaining to this just a couple of weeks ago at a advisory board that I'm on that deals with the NCIC computer.
Yes, okay, yeah.
Well, and for those of you that don't know what the NCIC computer is, if I stop you as a police officer and I run your information into this NCIC computer, it tells me all kinds of wonderful things about you. It's going to tell me your name, where you're from, your birth date. It's going to tell me if you've ever been arrested before. It's going to tell me if there's warrants for your arrest. It's going to tell me if there's traffic tickets on your record. But the other thing that is done since 9/11, it's been expanded considerably. It's going to tell me if you're on any kind of terrorist watch list. It's going to tell me if there's a protective order that's filed against you anywhere in the country. It's going to tell me things like if you're a known gang member or a suspected gang member. It's going to tell me all these wonderful things so that I can maybe take some precautions before I walk up to that car or after I make contact with you. I kind of can maybe put my guard up a little bit. And one of the things that it doesn't tell me is if you have a concealed carry license. And we've talked about maybe trying to incorporate that into some of the 911 systems and things like that. So if I'm dispatched to a particular address, for example, it's going to tell me that the person at that house has a concealed carry license, or the person that car is registered to has a concealed carry license. And I'll know those things before I even walk up to you. And a lot of people feel that would be a huge intrusion, huge invasion of their privacy. We don't want to register firearms so that people can't take them away from us. Well, nobody's trying to take the firearm away from you in that case. It just gives us a little heads up that we already know there's going to be a gun present when we get there. There again, it goes back to that public safety expectation. I mean, think of the old G.I. Joe when you guys were a kid. Remember at the end of that, they always had the little lesson. The more you know. Well, the more that we know when we walk into those situations, the better off we are. Better off we are. I'll give it back to you.
Final comments, questions?
All right, I've got a question for you.
Oh,
Go ahead.
she had her hand up. Go
I was
ahead.
going to see, I know like in the CAD system and some of the cops, it allow, like if you're going to resident that someone has AIDS and it pops up with a biohazard alert, I mean, would that be much different than saying, hey, there's guns?
I don't think it's much different.
I don't think so.
I really don't think it's much different at all. And the thing I always tell people is that we tend to forget sometimes that just because somebody has a concealed carry license or they can legally possess firearms doesn't mean that they're not having a really, really bad day, or that they haven't done something really bad that we're not aware of. And they, the truth of the matter is, if you're talking about homicides and things like that in the United States, most homicides are committed by somebody that the victim knows. The random stranger just pulling up and killing somebody is, not that it doesn't happen as often. Most of the time if somebody is killed, it's because they're killed by somebody they know. So we can all have bad days. All have bad days. What was your question?
Would you argue that the right to defend your own life is a natural right?
That's why I say sometimes a civil liberty can bleed over into a civil right. But again, that's that, while I would agree with that on the face of that is defined by society. For example, you have the stand your ground law. And so it's not always so simple to reduce that down to a simple statement of, well, I have a right to defend myself. I totally agree you do, and I would say it is a natural right under the Lockean notion of natural law, but that's something that the state still must decide. When a police officer who has the right to use deadly force, when he does, he's automatically put on leave to make sure that he did it the right way. He followed procedure, so it's the same for civilians. Yeah, you do have that right, but you can be named in civil lawsuits as well as criminal actions. So I would agree with it, but it still has to be defined by statute. Yeah.
I would argue, though, that, and I mentioned this in some of my law enforcement classes, that when it comes to using deadly force, it's a little bit different if you deliberately put yourself in harm's way. I mean, if I've got a guy that's speeding down the road in a car and I stand out in front of him to stop his car, if I deliberately stand in front of that speeding car, I'm putting myself in harm's way. And so I'm authorized to use deadly force, but I mean, I probably shouldn't have jumped in front of his car. The stand your ground law, when you're talking about that, there was a case out of Florida, and I kind of shake my head on this stand your ground law, where a guy went to a party and he got beat up at a party. And so he left the party, went back to his house, and he got a gun. And he went back to the party and had told his friends on the way back there, let them try that again and see what happens. They messed with him and he shot him. And that was upheld. To me, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, if somebody thumps on you, you don't go back and get a gun and say, let them try it again, because now that I'm armed, I can take their life.
Just because the decision was upheld doesn't make it the right decision.
I totally agree. You never know what a jury's going to do. You never know what a jury's going to do.
I think that one of the main problems we have on the legislative side is assuming that our legislative system works flawlessly. And basically, innocent people go to jail every day. So why take the risk of putting so much power in their hands already when they can't manage what power they already have efficiently? So,
well, what would you replace the legislature with?
Well, I was going to say...
I'm not saying replacement's the answer. I'm for minimalist government. I'm not saying anarchy is definitely not the right way to go. It's just stupid. But the government should only be able to tell you what to do to a certain extent. And there's a lot of things that make sense. It comes down to just because you can, doesn't mean you should. And that goes for the individual and the legislator.
That's true. I think the final thing here is the importance of our state elected officials. If you don't, and this again goes back to the federalism issue. If you don't like what your state legislature is doing, get rid of your legislators, get rid of your governor. If you like what they're doing, retain them. But the problem is so many people on both sides of this argument, they talk a good talk, but they don't register, they don't vote, they don't keep up with elections. And so you get what you vote for, you get what you pay for. I know what you're saying. There's a lot of factual basis to that, but ultimately you get what you deserve in your state governments. And our state elections are so, we talk about the turnout being low for federal offices. They're even lower for state and local, and those are the most important, as we've talked about today. So I agree with you on that.
All politics is local.
All politics is local.
All politics is local.
Thank you all for attending, guys. Thank you. More questions, we'll hang around. Thank you.